competitively riding motorcycles, and he's just signed for, so he was in, if you will, like the first division of British Superbikes, and now he's just signed for the Premier League. So when I got there, at previous races, you can just sort of walk around and you get to his team's crew area and all that jazz. But when I got there on Sunday, number one, it was all cordoned off, so it was marshalled. And I said, oh, I'm here to see Mr. Christy Rouse. They said, have you got any ID? You know, how do we know who you are? So they wouldn't let me through the barriers. So then I started texting them and said, you know, like a sort of, you know, teenage fan. Hi, Chris. You know, I'm here. Can you let me in, please? But unbeknown to me, he was so busy with sort of media and interviews and all that type of thing that he didn't get my message. So then I started texting his dad, saying, oh, hi there, Marty. It's Chico here. Any chance that you can get me in? And nothing at all. And eventually, it took me a long time, but eventually I did get in. But it's a whole, you know, it's a whole other level that he's now. He's real big time now. Now I paid to get into that race £35 for the ticket. Yes. Now that's a day's racing. A day's racing, might I add, £35. So it's not just one race. Oh really? Oh. Okay. Right, well, I hope you have a very nice day, and maybe we'll see you in September. I believe it's the 3rd of September. See you then. Have a lovely day. Is Serena your sort of chaperone for the day? Yeah. Excellent. And what about you, Joe? Are you here for the... Okay, now, how much would you, Nathan, be willing to pay for an entry ticket into British Superbikes?
Yeah, I think they could.
Now, Nathan would be willing to pay 30. Girls. Okay, what about you, Sydney? How much would you be willing to pay to get into a Superbike race? How much, sorry?
I wouldn't want to go, so like...
You wouldn't want... She wouldn't want to go?
More than £5, I probably wouldn't go.
More than?
£5, I probably wouldn't go.
Okay, £5, okay. Radhika?
£30 as well.
30 as well?
Yes, it's pretty cool.
Pretty cool, okay. That word cool was used a lot yesterday at Blackrock, wasn't it? Cool, everything was cool. What about you, Aaron?
Not much. I already care.
Put a number on it, please, if you don't mind, for the purposes of the example.
£20.
20, okay. Dylan?
£15?
Okay, so we're all willing to pay different amounts. I'm willing to pay the most, 35. I would have paid a bit more, possibly. If, the problem is, of course, when you ride up there and it's £35, you're not going to sort of say, oh, well, for an extra £5 I'm not paying, because you've gone to that effort to get there. But that means that whoever is making the price and setting the price, what do they need to know? They need some knowledge of our, and there's a special phrase which we've talked about before, our, thank you, page 4. They need to know our willingness to pay, aka what looks like. What looks like. Demand curve, exactly. Now that is very, as we discussed previously, knowing what your demand curve looks like relative to mine, relative to Serena's, relative to Philip's, etc., that's a very difficult thing for a firm to actually assess. Although we know from BlackRock's yesterday that they do have some very sophisticated methods of tracking these things. So you must have knowledge of individuals, that's S apostrophe, plural, WTP, willingness to pay, stroke demand. Now, of course, when we've looked at rational utility theory, we know that that's a very difficult thing to measure. But it's an assumption that we would be making here. And then lastly, what if because I could get away with this, because I look very young for my age. Thank you. What if I knew that one of you were passing the cinema and I said, because there's some rumours going around that, I think it's George putting this around that I don't like spending money. So, would you put your feet down, please? So there's some rumours going around that George was saying that every time I open my wallet there's moths flying, so being very rude like that. So, what if I saw you passing the cinema and I said, oh, I see that a student ticket for the cinema is £3. And I said, oh, here, will you just come in here, just get a student ticket and then just give it to me and I'll just, shimmy on through there, because obviously, student. Or it could be a mature student, of course. Is that the point that you're making? Thank you. I prefer undergrad. Okay. 18 to 21, I can get away with that, surely. Or, if you're passing the cinema, you could say, okay, I'll buy that ticket for £3, I'll sell it to you for £4. So you get the ticket and you also get something out of the transaction, out of the deal. So, why does everybody not do that? Why are people not going to the cinema and getting kids and young people and older people to buy all the tickets and then say, oh, there's a £5, and then taking the ticket and going into the cinema? Why are they not doing that? Yes?
Security.
There are checks and balances in place to make sure that doesn't happen. That sort of contamination where children's tickets and students' tickets are being used by adults. Now that's called market seepage, if it did happen. So there's this whole notion of that type of cross-contamination doesn't happen because, as you say, there's security checks and balances in place. So there must be measures in place to prevent market seepage. Because otherwise that whole structure wouldn't actually be a goer. You couldn't charge different prices to different people, because everyone would say, well, we'll go to the lowest common denominator price and we'll get around it somehow. But that doesn't happen. So point number 3 is that there must be checks and balances to prevent market seepage. Now, in your book, you find there's like a whole page on this stuff. Well, if you had a book, if you had an A2 book, yeah. Seepage. Okay. So those are the assumptions. Now diagram. So diagram. This is the easiest of the 3. This one. Seepage. Price, quantity, Okay, and draw your demand curve, but make sure you join it up to both axes. And then we want just a start point here of P1, Q1. So we're selling Q1 tickets at a price of P1. Now all this this is old hat to you, so I'm not going to sort of labour the points. So at P1, Q1, total revenue is equal to what? Robert?
Not sure.
Okay. Philip?
P1 times Q1.
P1 times Q1, remember, Robert? So if that was like £5 and that was 10 tickets, then obviously it's 5 times 10, which is 50. And so on that rectangle, excuse me, that's your total revenue in that instance. So I mean, it is basically, it's P1, Q1, isn't it? P1 times Q1. Now, Radhika, what the most important thing is this though? What's that?
Is that the consumer surplus?
It is, thank you. That is your CS, your consumer surplus. And just remind us, Radhika, if you wouldn't mind, the definition of consumer surplus.
Is that
Using the word satisfaction or utility.
is that the difference between?
Using the word satisfaction or utility.
I don't know. I can't remember.
Max?
The extra amount of utility derived from an additional unit. No.
That's marginal utility, I think you're on. Connor?
The difference between the market price and the price the consumers willing to pay.
Okay, so you're all more or less on the right lines, but what is it that you're getting for nothing?
Utility.
It's the utility or satisfaction that you're getting without having to pay for it. So, in the case of this first unit here, right, Q prime, how much are you willing to pay? You're willing to pay, so you'd have to go all the way to the demand curve, willingness to pay. You're willing to pay that. How much do you actually pay? You're only paying P1. So that distance there is obviously satisfaction derived but not paid for. Satisfaction derived without payment.
Would it be that area or
It would be the whole.
just that distance?
Well, it would be across there, wouldn't it? So it would be that. Now, the clever thing about the first degree price discriminator is that if you have the ability to set prices and charge different groups of people different prices, and you know the shape of demand and so on and so forth, looking at that, what would you rationally, as a rational businessman, want to do then? Because you've got this as revenue, and then you're sort of giving this away for free. I mean, that's mad. Nico, what do you think of that?
You would just increase your price.
Oh. Well, if you increased your price from P1 to Q1, then obviously you're going to sell less units, but the consumer surplus will be less, that's true. So what would you want to do, Aaron?
Charge a higher price for a higher willingness to pay.
And turn the consumer surplus into revenue, exactly. And that's what the price discriminator does. They recognise that we've got this area of consumer surplus, and so what they're trying to do by charging different groups of people different prices, they don't want you and I to have lots of consumer surplus, because that of course is consumer satisfaction. They want us to have some satisfaction, but really they want all the satisfaction. So how do they do it? For Q prime unit, they will price at P prime, here. So it's P prime. let's say that's the first unit. So what's the consumer surplus then? The consumer surplus is now only that. Above price, below demand. And this blue section, formerly, what's that now become? Revenue. That's now P prime times Q prime. So now that has also become part of this revenue. And then they recognise, okay, that's Mr. Clark, he was willing to pay £35 for that ticket, but actually Nathan's only willing to pay 30, let's say. So he's Q2, superscript 2. So how much is he willing to pay? Now we're assuming this is all on the same demand curve, make things straightforward. P2. And again, what happens to this area which was formerly consumer surplus? Serena, what's that now become? Again, that's revenue, so that's going red again. And consumer surplus is now reduced down for that particular individual, it's that triangle. And so all the while, the price discriminator, what they're doing is they're turning consumer surplus into revenue, blue to red. And they're minimising as far as possible the consumer surplus to these very small triangles. And that's what this notion of first degree price discrimination is. So when you get cinemas charging different prices for the same thing, they're recognising, of course an adult is willing to pay more because they're probably earning an income. The student isn't willing to pay. So let's assess how much they are willing to pay and let's jolly well charge them that. Because if we can do that, blue becomes red, consumer surplus becomes revenue, and consumer surplus is minimised, which is what the firm wants. So I guess on a final point on that one, you would need to make it clear that revenue is being transformed. Sorry, I've got that the wrong way around, haven't I? Consumer surplus is being transformed into revenue. You okay there? You caught that from Philip yesterday? He was coughing and wheezing.
I think he went for that from the...
Oh really? Is that okay, Philip?
You know for Q2.
Q2, yes?
Yeah. Why does the triangle not go all the way?
Because we're assuming that you're actually charging, although this is all on one demand curve,
Yeah.
we're assuming that we're charging different groups or different individuals different prices for the same good. So this is like good number 2, which we're selling at this price, and this is good number 1, which we're selling at this price. Although we're not illustrating that on 2 separate demand curves. Okay, so that's first degree. Let's, are we all happy with that, Nicole?
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on then. Let's get second degree done then.
Now, this second degree one, this is what you're observing on your BA flights, second degree, primarily. So what do we say happens? We said that if you're booking a ticket, you'll find what on a flight? What is it you find on a flight, pricing wise? Charleston?
The closer you get the time you're going to fly, it's going to be more expensive.
Okay, correct. So if you book well in advance, you probably get a cheaper price than if you book closer to the flight departure. For those of you who joined me in Brussels a couple of weeks ago, you'll remember that Mr. David Wood also, not only did he say that that's to do with the sort of the time, but he also talked about the fact that these airline companies, if you give them lots of notice in advance, i.e. book well in advance, then they know how much food they need, they know how much, all their other sort of costs, the fuel costs probably generally be the same, but they know what their costs are, and because of that, they're in a better position to give you a better price. Whereas if you leave it to the last minute, and all of a sudden there's a rush on, that puts them in an awkward position with regard to budgeting and costing flights and so on, and that is another reason why the price shoots up the closer that you get to the time of departure. But anyway, let's get the diagram done for this one. So this is a slightly more complicated one. This is a more sort of monopolistic style diagram for this one. Now,
What is that?
sorry,
What is
it's
that?
obvious, I think. Okay, so if you travel business class, right, on a jumbo jet,
Why are the wings at the back?
sorry,
Why are the wings right at the back? That's the engine.
okay, so if you travel business class, let's say this is I've never been on a jumbo jet, but I did watch a programme about a jumbo jet on Sunday evening. It's called The History of the Jumbo Jet. It's two-parter, absolutely. I thought it was fascinating. Airbus. Or was it Boeing? Great example of a duopoly, isn't it? Airbus and Boeing dominating the skies. Anyway, so if you go in business class, you walk up there, you go left, first class. I think the first class on a jumbo's up here, so you've got the sort of cockpit up here and the first class behind it. And then this is where, your economy class, but this is where I always sit, sort of, in the cheapest seats at the back, sort of thing. Now, we've talked about this before in terms of costing. What is the marginal cost of providing another seat on the plane? Yes. Very little, exactly. Once you have forked out the enormous hundreds of thousands, I don't know how much a jumbo jet is, into the tens of millions, I imagine. But once you've forked out the monies on the initial build costs, if you want to put another row of seats in there, it's probably doable at fairly low cost. And as a consequence of that, the marginal costs for a firm such as this are they're fairly constant. So rather than in the past you've done your marginal costs like that, U-shaped, marginal costs in this instance would just draw as perfectly elastic. But at some point, you're going to reach a point where the plane is full. That is capacity. So there's no more room to accommodate any more passengers. So then what happens to marginal cost? Then it shoots up, exactly. Then it becomes, so it's enormously costly, because you might have to, I don't know, build a new level or something like that. What's that? Well, you've got that double-decker. What's that plane called? The A380. Anyone been on an A380? Roshan? How many times?
A3, maybe 4.
4 times. How come?
Dubai to Malaysia, Malaysia to Dubai.
To where, sorry?
Back to Dubai. They usually use A380s for that run. We'll probably be on one when we go to Indonesia.
Really?
So, yeah, they usually use them on that run.
Were you on that as well?
I don't think so. Can't remember.
Was this part of the F1 thing, or was this part of a family holiday?
No, the Indonesia thing is with Miss Clegg.
No, I know that, but I mean the previous time.
Oh, the previous time is just with family.
With who?
Family.
Oh, right. Okay. Excellent. You're a very privileged young man, aren't you, Roshan?
I don't see the difference between flying on an A380.
Very privileged young man, oh yes. Right. So the extra cost is enormous, so marginal cost then becomes perfectly inelastic, like so. So that's your marginal cost curve. Otherwise known as what? Supply. Okay. Now, what's the profit maximizing output rule?
You produce when MR equals MC.
MC equals MR. Are the likes of EasyJet, BA, do they want to maximise profits? Of course they do. So remember here your profit maximising output rule, i.e. profits are maximised where marginal costs equal marginal revenues. So we need to put on our marginal revenue curve, like so. And if I just remind you maybe of the monopoly diagram to help you here, so this is AR, MR, MC, there's MC equals MR, so that's your profit maximising output. How do you get the price? You need the AR curve, which is also the demand curve, because we go up from there to AR and then across, that gives us price. So what do we need to add here? Monica, what's missing? The AR curve, correct. So we want to put AR, like so, demand.
Just have to go through this.
Has to go through, yeah, it needs to go through here somewhere.
Does the AR necessarily have to intersect with the x-axis?
No.
Okay, good.
Okay. So, this is an interesting conundrum for an airline firm, because if they're profit maximisers, they're going to produce where MC equals MR. Well, where does MC equal MR? There. So that's the number of seats that you're going to sell on your plane if you want to maximise profit, Q1. So you're going to sell Q1 seats at a price P1. But why is that an interesting conundrum?
So the full capacity.
Exactly. If you do that, you're not at capacity. So what are you going to have on the plane? What are you going to have on the plane? Empty seats. So you've got X amount here of empty seats. Now, number one, I've been a customer on. I used to get a little plane to Belfast now and then. It was called Flybe. I don't know if you've ever heard of that company, flybe.com. But the flights always used to be, I would say, 50% capacity and